spend some time with the first member of the Kong crew as the 19th episode of Good Intentions comes to its end. A big part of what makes Donkey Kong work is that the game's different stages play out as a narrative. Nothing particularly elaborate, but easily grasped thanks to its thematic familiarity. Sadly, this was something lost on NES. The arcade game, however, begins with Kong abducting a lady named Pauline, climbing to the top of the first level, and setting the stage for the action by throwing the nice even girders into disarray. Each level is meant to represent a different segment of the 100-meter high construction project that Kong has scarpered away to, and each stage opens with a challenge. How high can you get? In the end, you rescue Pauline and enjoy a simple animation that puts a bow on the whole thing, as Kong is upended and the lady kisses Mario for all of his hard work. The game also allowed for a fair amount of technique and variability. The movement of barrels and fireballs had an element of randomness, while fixed environmental hazards worked in a more rigid fashion. You could lure fireballs and even affect the movement of barrels to a certain point, and each level offered multiple routes to the top. In the 25-meter stage, you could climb up several different ladders per tier. You could conquer the 50-meter stage by going up either the left or right side, and the 75-meter stage offered both a high and low route. Finally, the 100-meter level was completely open and could be tackled however players preferred. Every stage contained 3 of Pauline's personal accessories to collect for extra points. And of course, in several stages you could choose to grab a hammer and smash up foes, or not, with the trade-off being that you couldn't climb while hammering and would burn up precious time until the weapon vanished. There was a lot happening in Donkey Kong, but the intuitive nature of the action and the progressive rollout of mechanics across the 4 stages paired neatly with the Hollywood-esque tale being spun to create an experience that drew players in and rewarded them for coming to terms with all that was being asked of them. Donkey Kong felt like the next natural step in the evolution of action games, and had it arrived either a year sooner or a year later, it probably wouldn't have gone over nearly as well. Nintendo's risk-taking design ambition was born of necessity, though. Donkey Kong didn't come about because someone thought, our next game should be a run-and-jump adventure inspired by King Kong. Rather, the company desperately needed to come up with a new game concept to stand out from the crowd. See, Nintendo had released several arcade games in the Space Invaders Galaxian mold throughout 1979 and 1980. The most popular of these in Japan, Radarscope, featured a very impressive visual effect that created the sensation of a tilted perspective in which the enemy's craft scaled in size as they approached and retreated from the player's position. Nintendo earmarked Radarscope for a significant US rollout, confident that it would find equal success overseas. Unfortunately, Space Invaders had never been as popular in the US as in Japan, and by the time thousands of Radarscope cabinets made their way across the Pacific for American distribution, that entire style of game felt like old news. US distributors only purchased about half of Nintendo's shipment, leaving 1,000 unwanted Radarscope cabinets unsold in a warehouse. Eager not to see the entire US arm go bankrupt, Nintendo set about creating a conversion kit for the Radarscope hardware. Shigeru Miyamoto, a fairly recent hire who had been producing art and hardware designs for things like the Block Kazushi standalone Pong clone console, came up with the design for Donkey Kong. Its 4-stage cycle of run-and-jump challenges looked and played like nothing that had ever appeared in arcades before. Miyamoto worked with the company's engineering subcontractors to convert the game concept into real code, and Kong shipped, becoming an immediate hit. Again, the game's timing couldn't have been better. The American arcade had reached its peak popularity thanks to Pac-Man, and Donkey Kong arrived on the scene with the nicest graphics, most memorable characters, and most wonderfully varied gameplay. It became an international success, far beyond Nintendo's hopes and ambitions. Combined with the popularity of the Game & Watch handheld line, Donkey Kong made Nintendo a major force in the games industry, and it fueled the company's next ambition, to launch its own console. Quarters and 100 yen pieces alike were still piling up in the coin catchers of Donkey Kong machines around the world when Nintendo embarked on its most daring adventure to date, the development of a new gaming console, which would arrive 2 years later as the Family Computer. According to Nathan Altus's excellent book I Am Error, the Family Computer project was designed with several goals in mind, but chief among them was the ability to play a flawless game of Donkey Kong. This was no small task. Donkey Kong was, at the time, a cutting-edge, dedicated arcade cabinet, a game that looked and sounded fantastic because it ran on expensive hardware specifically created for that purpose. The Famicom, on the other hand, would need to make Donkey Kong work with interchangeable cartridges on multi-purpose hardware, all in a package that could be priced competitively versus other consoles on the market. This demanded a combination of engineering genius and a fair number of technical shenanigans. But hardware designer Masayuki Uemura and his small team pulled it off, more or less. Donkey Kong on Famicom didn't quite reach arcade perfection, but it looked, sounded, and played even more accurately than any other home conversion to date, even more so than the impressive ColecoVision port. Some of Donkey Kong's compromises on NES were hard to avoid. The arcade cabinet, for example, used a portrait-oriented monitor, where the Famicom had to be designed for consumer televisions arranged in landscape orientation. The arcade board had a pixel resolution of 224 by 256, while the Famicom offered the inverse, 256 by 224. So several levels suffered from slight vertical compression, most notably the opening 25-meter stage, which saw poor Kong and Pauline scraping their heads against the top of the screen. The other major compromise had to do with the harsh data storage limitations of early Famicom carts. The first wave of the games for the system offered far less memory capacity than Donkey Kong's arcade board had contained, and certain compromises had to be made. Nintendo ended up chopping out an entire level, the fussy cement factory stage, along with the memorable opening cinematic and stage goal screens. When players pressed start, they heard that familiar, ominous introductory dirge, but rather than accompanying an animation of Kong's hostile opening stage demolitions, the tune simply played over the title screen. Despite these alterations, Donkey Kong for Famicom and NES definitely came closer to the arcade experience than any other conversion of the game that had yet shipped. Even with the vertical compression, the graphics looked almost arcade perfect, and the sound came remarkably close despite lacking the gritty boom of the coin-op samples. It didn't have all the stages, but the 3 stages that did appear played correctly with no significant compromises. While some other versions of the game did include the opening animations or the cement factory stage, none of those looked nearly as faithful as this one. Even the previous high watermark of ports for Coleco had removed an entire tier of girders from the 25-meter stage. Nintendo simply offered the best possible home rendition of Donkey Kong, which was only fitting since it was, after all, their game. In 1983, when the Famicom launched, a near-perfect conversion of Donkey Kong was a pretty enticing prospect, especially in Japan, which had largely been isolated from the American console experience thanks to the horrible dollar-to-yen exchange rate. Donkey Kong ended up being the best-selling Famicom game of 1983, unsurprisingly. What might be surprising was that the US version of the game didn't arrive until nearly 3 years later, and it was exactly the same as the Japanese release. Now by this point, NES cartridge ROM capacity had grown considerably from the days of the Famicom launch. Nintendo could easily have reworked the US release of the game to include all the cut material, but they didn't. I can certainly see the appeal of a zero-effort conversion. The Japanese game didn't contain any Japanese text, so the NES release literally consisted of the Japanese ROM with a different cartridge shell and chip pinout. But it does seem like something of a missed opportunity. Donkey Kong still had enough cachet and name recognition that it was going to sell regardless, but Nintendo could have gone the extra step to make its NES version of the game as close to perfect as possible. Sadly, we wouldn't see a fully restored NES release for the game until nearly a quarter of a century later. In 2010, Nintendo cobbled together an official ROM hack of the NES game, which they called Donkey Kong Original Edition, and preloaded onto a limited edition Wii console. Original Edition also became available as a limited edition loyalty program incentive download for 3DS owners a couple of years later. It was not, however, included on the recent NES Classic Edition mini console, nor has it been widely available through other means, for some reason. Nevertheless, some version of Donkey Kong has been available for purchase on a Nintendo system almost constantly since 1983. The company phased out the US Black Box series in 1988, but Donkey Kong and its sequel were immediately crammed into a combo cart called Donkey Kong Classics, which remained in circulation more or less until the NES was discontinued in 1994. That, as it turned out, was the point at which Nintendo released the masterful Donkey Kong for Game Boy, which started out resembling nothing more than a monochrome port of the game, but soon dropped a shocking fact. It contained about 100 extra levels. Donkey Kong for Game Boy remained available for several years, and around the time it faded from sale, fans could unlock the entire original arcade game as a bonus in 1999's Donkey Kong 64. Then, in 2002, as the N64 went away, Donkey Kong appeared as one of about 24 NES games that could be unlocked in Animal Crossing for GameCube. Around the same time, it also launched as a scannable card that worked with the Game Boy Advance's e-reader. 2 years later, it appeared as an NES Classic retail release for Game Boy Advance, which kept it in circulation until the Wii launched with Virtual Console, where it's been available on an increasing number of platforms over the past decade. Donkey Kong played a critical role in Nintendo's history, and they've more or less treated it with the respect that you'd expect, even if legal issues seemingly prevent the arcade version from seeing the light of day. So even if the NES release of the game seems a bit anticlimactic in hindsight, at the time it marked the point at which Nintendo made its nationwide push for the NES. And yeah, it was overshadowed in the US by Super Mario Bros., which probably couldn't be helped. We received 3 years of Japanese Donkey Kong games and sequels in a single go, whereas in Japan the franchise had room to evolve over time. But so it goes. Donkey Kong remains one of gaming's most important works, and one of Nintendo's biggest names. Of course it was there on NES almost from day one, looking about as good as it possibly could have. Whatever else you might say about this adaptation of the game, it was there and still offered fans some nostalgic fun, even if it did feel like it belonged to a generation of hardware that the NES quietly lowered into a grave. Next on Good Intentions, believe it or not, a second Donkey Kong game.